And a very warm welcome to Japan House London. My name is Sam Thorne. I'm Director General here. And as our panel getting themselves comfortable, I'm going to say a few words of welcome. Welcome, first of all, to everyone here, and welcome to everybody joining us online. We are streaming this evening's event on YouTube, on Zoom, on LinkedIn, and on X. We are really happy to be working with Chatham House on this evening's event. Timely, important subject, I think you'll all agree. This is the third and final episode in a collaboration with Chatham House, and thank you to them for that partnership. A few words of introduction to Japan House. We opened in 2018. Our mission is to bring the very best of Japan and Japanese cultures to London, to Europe, and so on, and to foster conversation, as you can see is happening already on stage right now. We host exhibitions, we host events such as this one, we have a shop, a restaurant, so many other things. Our role we really see is convening discussions between different worlds of arts, design, craft, architecture, but also policy, business, innovation. We're always looking back and thinking about what happens next. So with that in mind, it leaves me only to pass over to Ben Bland. Ben is Chatham House's Director of Asia Pacific Program. He's going to be introducing the panelists. And now please join me in welcoming this evening's speakers. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone joining us here at Japan House in London and wherever you are in whatever time zone. If you're online, thanks for being with us. My name is Ben Bland. As Sam said, I'm the Director of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House. It's a pleasure to be here at Japan House in London. We've had an event series with Japan House over the last few years, but with COVID and other things getting in the way, we didn't manage to do an in-person event until this point. So it's really great to be here in this lovely space. So thanks to everyone at Japan House, Japanese Embassy, and particularly my colleague, Chloe Sageman, for helping organize everything. We're here to discuss a really important topic, bridging the gap. How can the G7, which is a group of 7 of the world's richest countries in the EU, including Japan and the UK and others, work with the global south, developing countries, to better tackle the key challenges facing our world at a time when I think it's fair to say our world is fragmenting. Just a few ground rules before I introduce the panelists. This event is a Chatham House and Japan House event, but it's not under the Chatham House rule, so it's on the record. We're being live streamed and recorded, so I hope that's clear. If you're online, we'd love to take your questions, so please leave them using the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will try to get to them. We're also going to come to your questions in the room, but first I'm going to introduce the panelists, then I'll ask them questions for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have a good amount of time for your questions. And then for those here, we have a drinks reception outside afterwards, which should be fun, less fun if you're online, but you can pour your own drink and think about what you're missing out on. So I just want to briefly introduce a great and very diverse panel that we have tonight with really interesting and different perspectives. So firstly, to my left, we have Her Excellency Namisha Madhvani. She's the High Commissioner of Uganda in London. Also, she told me, the representative for Uganda to the EU, to the Republic of Ireland, to the Commonwealth, and the International Maritime Organization. Any others I'm missing? Commonwealth. So yeah, a lot of responsibilities there. And it's great to have Namisha here because Uganda is currently the chair of the G77, which is an organization set up in 1964 to represent developing countries at the UN and elsewhere around the world. There's now 135 member countries, I think, including China, although often it's called G77 plus China, but a really important voice for developing countries around the world. And they just had their South-South Summit in Uganda earlier this year, where there were some really interesting conclusions, which we'll be talking about shortly. Next to Namisha, we have Suzuki Kazuto, who's a professor of science and technology policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. He is here for a whistle-stop 24 hours or less in London, which is quite amazing. He's still awake and very cogent and interesting. So amazing credit to your sleeping skills. And thanks again for being with us. Kazuto, And also with me is my colleague at the end, Chitij Bajpai. He's our new Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at Chatham House. So we've got interesting perspectives, South Asia, Japan, Africa, a lot to get into on these key questions. I mean, in my research before this panel discussion, I was looking through the different statements that come out of the G7 and the G77. You see the framing of issues and the issues that people talk about are so different. You can see these kind of key divisions around political values, obviously around levels of development. But then if you think about the big geopolitical issues at the moment in the world, Ukraine, the war in Israel and Gaza, attitudes to China, very big splits really between the G7 and the global South. First question I really want to come to here is, and I'm going to ask you, Nimisha, about this, is what's your perspective, as an African, currently your country is chairing the G77. How worried are you about these gaps, these splits opening up between rich countries and the developing world?
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here, and I hope one day you'll visit Uganda. It's a great country. So if we can host 6.5 billion people right now as chair of G77 plus China and NAM, non-aligned movement, look forward to welcoming you all. Of course, one of the biggest worries for the South-South countries is the imbalance of, first of all, there's poverty. There's also the issue of borrowing money at different rates. And one of the key factors that we had in the Kampala Declaration in January is that we need to look at bridging the amount of money that can be borrowed and should be on equal terms. And there should be a lot more equality. There should not be so much involvement in the politics of the countries, but actually focusing on the business at hand. And this is where the key is, because we need to have that opportunity as as Ben mentioned, the countries that are members of the G77 plus China and non-aligned movement. So I think that's very, very important. And to have proper free trade agreements that really hold through and that they don't get canceled due to some political issue. So, you've got to have, like at the EU, we have an EU treaty for Africa, everything but arms. And with India, with TICAD, we also have duty-free. We have with China. We are now set up the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So United States should also keep their agreement on their Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. I think just to start with, I would rather just say that much. Thank you.
Great. So I'm sure we're going to come back and go a bit deeper into these issues. Kazuto, I want to come to you next, because Japan was the president of the G7 last year. Now it's Italy. I mean, do you think Japan did a good job of trying to bridge this gap? And yeah, how worried are you about it opening up? Because to me, it is really stark when you just read these different statements. It's almost like, they're on different planets, the rich countries and the rest.
Well, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for Japan House, Embassy of Japan, and also Chatham House for organizing this. I think this is a very worrying time that the G7, I mean, Japan was a chair last year, and Japan has invited India, the Prime Minister of India, and President of Brazil as the representative of the Global South. But the problem is that there is no such thing as the Global South as a group. I mean, yes, there is a G77 plus China, and but the concept of Global South is much bigger and much blurred. I mean, it's not really clearly defined. But still, the G7 used the term Global South. So I think there is a sort of a misunderstanding that there is some grouping of G7 and the Global South, and there are a certain gap between these two. Yes, there are gaps between the G7 and the rest of the world, but I think the time that G7 was the conductor of the global economic order has no longer the case. And I think it was a painful experience for Japan and the other G7 members to realize that it's no longer the case that once G7 decided, then everything works accordingly. I mean, in the past, like in 1970s, the G7 aggregate of the G7 GDP is about 80% of the global wealth, but today it's about 60%. So I think it's the size of the G7, the influence of the G7 is getting lower, and I think we have to recognize that the impact of the G7 agreement does not really change that much as it did before. So I think the role of G7 has to be different, although I think it is important still to have this solidarity among the G7 countries, but we shall not, overestimate the power of G7. So I think that was the sort of the theme of the day is about the gap, but I think one of the way to bridge the gap is to change the mindset of the G7 countries.
Thanks, Kizito. And I mean, thinking about the gap and who can bridge it, I want to come to you, Tishas, because people often think about India as this possible bridge, and I think some key foreign policy thinkers in India also think about India in that way. We know that the UK, Japan, the US, Australia have really courted India, and sort of India operates in this position where on the one hand, I think it's quite successful at convincing Western governments that it's moving closer to their position on a lot of key issues, while also often presenting itself as a leader of the global south. So how do you think India is playing that bridging role? And do you think you see that as a good place for India to be in the coming years and actually having practical answers to some of these questions?
So I think there's a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. So the rhetoric is that, India very much sees itself as a bridging power between the global south and the G7, between the advanced industrialized economies and the emerging economies. And we saw this very much during its G20 presidency, where it hosted this Voice of the Global South Summit, which over 120 countries were invited, facilitated the entry of the African Union into the G20. It offered so-called Indian solutions to global problems, so whether it be on global health, on climate, on digital public infrastructure, all through the prism of the global south. It's offered this rhetoric of India as a Vishwamitra, or a friend of the world. And this, I think, has been embraced to a large extent by countries in the G7, that India offers a non-Western worldview, but not an explicitly anti-Western worldview, which other countries such as China or Russia or Iran would seek to promote. And the fact that India and Japan simultaneously held the G20 and the G7 presidencies last year also, I think, fueled or prompted a degree of coordination between both countries, given the close relationship between New Delhi and Tokyo. So that, I think, is the rhetoric. The reality is that India still has a long way to go. Despite talk of slowdown in China's economy or the drop in its outbound investment since about 2016, China remains the only game in town in large parts of the global south. So India, still it lacks the economic heft that the Chinese have in terms of their outbound investment. Then, in terms of I think the jury is also out to a degree on the degree to which there is coordination between India and or an alignment between India and G7 countries, in the sense both in terms of interests and values. So the fact that India is part of several institutions or groupings that are challenging the Bretton Woods system, for instance, the BRICS, just pushing for a de-dollarization of trade to a degree. So I think that raises concerns. The fact that on human rights, India often seems more closely aligned with China than it does with G7 countries. So for instance, its position on developments in Iran or Myanmar or Russia, they seem to be more closely aligned with China's position than that of the United States. So I think I think there is a gap between the rhetoric and the substance of India's position as being a potential leader or a bridging power between the G7 and the global south.
And Nimisha, we talk a lot about the global south. I mean, it's not a great term, but how much do you think there is a kind of solidarity? How much, do you think that the G77, these 135 countries, can sort of meaningfully work together on, a lot of very, very complicated issues? And for development partners, for Japan or UK or others, helpful to think still in terms of the global south, or should we be thinking about other groupings or just bilateral relationships?
I actually think that the summits that we held in January really brought together countries from the Caribbean, from Africa, from South America, from Asia, China, Cuba, etc. In fact, it was interesting that some of the Western countries wanted to, suddenly in the middle, wanted to come and be observers, but of course, that's not possible. However, no, I think the answer to that is definitely not. I think that Africa has galvanized with leadership and its positive development, and to bring in, and Prime Minister Modi to include Africa into the G20. We have BRICS. BRICS is now expanding. It's brought in countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, along with South Africa, which is part of, and Africa Union is also there. And so when we talk about Global South, in fact, the way the dialogues went, nobody was actually thinking that it was a derogatory term at all. In fact, it was as if we were really a strong group and a big bloc of nations. And just recently, when we signed, for example, the Samoa Agreement, it opened up monies for development within Africa. So, you know, these things are $200 million. For those who in the G7, you may not think 200 million is a lot of money, but in some circumstances it is. Yes, if you're going to put, you know, billions into war and conflict, that's prerogative of the G7. We want to create a conflict resolution through peace process, not just going out there and pouring tons of money in hope of development and reconstruction after the war. And then also is, of course, that, you know, we don't want to be lagging behind in the SDGs, and we really look to the G7 and the richer countries to scale up on their funding. So this is very, very important that we all start getting to a level playing field and that we start working together for a world with so many issues, climate change issues, et cetera, et cetera.
And from sort of the perspective of Uganda, you know, chairing the G77, do you see any kind of low-hanging fruit or areas where, you know, more cooperation might be more straightforward? Because there's a lot of, you know, a lot of ambitions to reform the IMF and the World Bank and the UN, and yeah, that's obviously going to be very long term. But in the shorter term, are there kind of easier things where you think there's space for cooperation?
Well, one of the key messages that came out of the summit was looking to reform for the World Bank and the international monetary situation as institutions. So this was a very big call, you know, overall, and it's part of our Kampala declaration. And the theme of the summit was global affluence. You know, that was one of the main messages of, you know, 6.5 billion people. And one of the messages to the Commonwealth was to have an inclusive influence. So 49 countries of the 56 countries of the Commonwealth are in the G77 plus China and non-aligned movement. So we are already embracing most of these organizations. So it's definitely a call out to the G7 countries to come, join us and work together.
And is there, I mean, people often ask, because I work at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, what's the role of the Commonwealth? And I've only been back in the UK a couple of years, and being very frank, I often struggle to answer, but do you think there is a role there specifically for the UK through the Commonwealth? Is that maybe one of the areas where they can reignite some new engagement?
Definitely, because you've got the leadership of the Court of St. James is His Majesty the King, and the head of the Commonwealth is His Majesty the King. So 100% they can influence. And actually, one of the main things of the Commonwealth with the Secretary General and all the arrangements is focusing on youth, skilling, creating a broader inclusiveness of people who are unemployed. There's unemployment in America. There's unemployment in the UK. There's, you know, these are huge bridges that they, you know, the idea is that let's work together to close these gaps. And the Commonwealth can play a very key role because so many members of the countries are in the other countries, other blocs as well. So we are now operating in Uganda. President Museveni, under his leadership at the summit, very clear that we can, if we are together, we can work together and strengthen the message to everyone and bridge that gap, build a closer, working actual, not rhetoric, but actual effect on the ground.
And Kazuto, coming to you on this problem of how to actually affect change, Japan's obviously had long-standing development partnerships in Africa and Southeast Asia and many parts of the world, very effective, tends to work quite quietly below the radar. I mean, to what extent is the sort of talk of more G7 cooperation, and especially all the geopolitics and politics, to what extent does that actually undermine some of these other efforts that Japan has had very successfully in the developing world in the last few decades? And how can Japan balance the need to sort of align with the US and its allies on basically competition with China and big geopolitical questions, as against quietly managing these sort of values-free, very pragmatic development partnerships?
But I think there are two layers of actions on the international aid or international development support. On the surface, I think this is pretty much colored by the the geopolitical rivalries. The China has been a very strong player as its Belt and Road Initiative. But well, if you look at the numbers, then the Belt and Road Initiative has just declined its spending since 2017. So I think the impact of the Chinese investment has a mixed result. I think the situation in Sri Lanka, for example, or other countries in Pakistan, etc., there are many failures of the Belt and Road Initiative. But from the US point of view, the international aid is pretty much dominated by this competition between China and the United States, and there are certain push for international or Western collaboration to support the countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But the below the radar, as you said, I mean, there's other strata of the economic activities, and I think Japan has been doing quite a significant investment in, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian issues, or the support for the environmental conditions in Iran, or there are many other places that Japan has done it in quietly. So there are a couple prime examples which surfaced in these cases. For example, the investment in infrastructure in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia in general. And I think this is partially because for Japan, as in a long history after the World War II, Japan has not been able to make its claim or its influence through diplomatic or the military means, but we were able to use these official development aid as the geopolitical or geoeconomic tool to get certain influence in this area. So I think Japan has been doing that, and for a long time, as a very quiet, not sort of a flashy geopolitical affairs. But I think these will be continued, and I think this sort of investment has established Japan as a credible creditor in the international aid.
And Chichu, I know in your earlier remarks you were a bit skeptical about what India can deliver, but where do you think India can deliver? If you sort of put your more optimistic hat, or pragmatically, where do you think that India does have the ability to to offer useful public goods to key partners in the rest of the global South?
So I think India has played a long-standing role in the global south, but I would say it's very sectoral specific. So I think in certain domains like education, healthcare, I think technical assistance and capacity building, even to a degree of democracy promotion, things like the provision of electronic voting machines and indelible ink, which is used, constitution drafting, it's helped in several countries, particularly those that are former British colonies. And most recently, it's the area of digital public infrastructure. And I think that was the clear, one of the major takeaways of the G20 summit. And this is an area where you can potentially improve welfare disbursements, empower citizens that previously lacked access to banking services or education or healthcare benefits, and a means of essentially having these direct benefit transfers help to reduce the space for corruption. So this, I think, is an area where India can clearly add value, and it's an area where it has engaged with countries, G7 countries, not only because of its credentials in the technology space, but also its credentials as the world's largest democracy. So frankly, to put it bluntly, countries would much rather, or G7 countries would much rather work with India on issues of data privacy or transparency than to work with China, given concerns over its techno-surveillance state. So I think that there are clear areas where India can add value, but I think it's on particular sectors and industries.
And just a reminder to people online, you can start asking your questions using the Q&A function. So yeah, don't hesitate to get them in if you want to have a chance to have them asked, and let us know if you want to direct them to any particular participant. I want to come to you, Nimisha, on the geopolitical questions of our time, competition with China, the war in Ukraine, obviously Israel, Gaza. I mean, how much do you think that these problems are just going to put extra splits between G77 and the West or the G7? How challenging do you think it's going to be to keep cooperation on the rails when, quite frankly, the different groups of countries have very different perspectives on a lot of these issues, which I think are very important to all the countries concerned, even if they take very different positions?
From the summits and the dialogues, of course, as I said earlier, the areas of those conflicts, it was everyone had come to a unilateral agreement on the way forward. They were not. It was not just split that, oh, this group said this and this group said that and that group. No, there was an agreement on both Palestine and Israel, and on the issue of Gaza. Yes, it was absolutely abysmal what was going on. That was talked about, but there should be a two-state solution. That was agreed in the entire context on the Russia-Ukraine. Similar that there shouldn't be this Western world of supporting and dividing the rest of the world. So there was not so much. And then the other thing was that, for some of the countries that were approached to give a side, either, the Bush quote that either you're with us or you're with them. Everybody has their own different issues. I mean, today in Africa, you've got challenges going on. You've got challenges in South America, the Caribbean state, the environment that was touched on, the small island states that have got, environment impact issues. So this is where our focuses should be rather than on those conflicts only.
And do you think then, can we have progress on these issues while the world's two biggest powers are still at loggerheads? I mean, will it take US and China to have a better relationship to unlock more global progress on climate change, on the digital divide, on sort of norms and a way forward about how to manage artificial intelligence? Or do you think it's still possible to find solutions even while, this competition between the two big powers continues?
I think already dialogues are beginning, and that dialogue is what was part of the summit, that you've got to have a dialogue, and that has to be that way. And the competition, that's private sector. Competition is going to be there, whether it's individual companies, whether it is like India is talking about helping on digital and helping on that. And they're doing a lot, not just, and I don't think they're very focused on helping, on working with. They're not helping. They're actually, lending money at a good rate, and it's a business deal. It's not just some charity organization, for example. With Japan, we have an excellent relationship on some of these matters as well, and United States, and we would. But the point here is that dialoguing is the way forward, is what was key.
And Chichi, I know we were just together in Washington, D.C. last week. I mean, what was your sense out of those meetings about U.S. interest in engaging with the global South? I mean, do you think there is an appetite to do anything beyond just trying to sort of chase China's tail?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem in the way that the G7 and frankly, maybe I should be more specific, the West and the US look at the global South is this overemphasis on looking at it through the prism of geopolitics, through the prism of competing with China. So this idea that challenging China's Belt and Road Initiative or its global development, civilization, or security initiatives, this narrative of China's debt trap diplomacy or its coercive economic activities or predatory economic activities, that resonates in the G7, doesn't resonate to the same degree in the global South. As I said earlier, in many parts of the global South, China remains the only game in town. And while I was, at the outset, I was critiquing some of India's approach towards the global South, the rhetoric outweighing the reality. The same applies to the G7 to a degree. We have several initiatives where there's been more statements than substance. The US is the best example, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, which builds on the Build Back Better World initiative, the Blue Dot initiative. I think the Trump administration has something called the Build Act. There've been several initiatives, but they've not really gone anywhere. So I think the issue is the statements outweigh the substance to a degree, and there's too much emphasis on the geopolitics and not looking at the interests or the needs of the global South or the inherent needs of these countries in the global South, but looking at it through the prism of geopolitical rivalry with Beijing.
And on that point, because you said, do you feel that Japan, the UK as US allies, do you think we have much ability to shape US thinking in terms of how they engage with the rest of the world? Is that a role that sort of good allies and friends can play to maybe suggest if they're going on a slightly wrong path, or is that pointless basically with a major superpower and we just have to accept what we have?
But I think the United States is taking a sort of a path of not based on the international rules, but on its own interest and the power. And I think that is also true for Russia invading Ukraine, and also Israel to a certain extent, using the power to shape the international world. And of course, China is the one that to still overrating its own power to exercise an influence against other countries. So I think there are countries, including the United States, are shifting towards more power-based international order, whereas Japan, UK, and the rest of the Western countries are more still maintain the idea of the rule-based international order. And I think this gap is much wider than the gap between the G7 and the Global South. I think it is extremely difficult to force or to shape the US thinking, largely because the United States is so dominated by the internal division, the liberals and the conservatives, or those, a social division is so serious. And especially this year is a year of election, and both candidates are so keen on getting hold of the very significant states like Pennsylvania. So this is one of the reasons why the President Biden, as well as Mr. Trump, as a candidate of Republican, are against the proposal by the Nippon Steel to buy U.S. steel, which is, I think, economically sound proposal, but they are just doing this because of the response by the labor union, and also because of the image that U.S. Steel represents the United States, and it shouldn't be bought out by anybody, including the allies. So if United States take that position, it's really difficult to shape their mindset. And what we need to do is, I think the example of the TPP is good, perhaps is suggestive, because when Japan and Obama administration has negotiated about, setting up a free trade agreement called Trans-Pacific Partnership (TPP), but when President Trump was inaugurated, on the first day, he just left TPP. So when the TPP was just going down in the pieces, the Prime Minister Abe has just initiated to take all these pieces together and brought it as a CPTPP, which is now the UK. UK is the member. So I think this has been a successful example that those countries which still believe that the rule-based international order is important will remain in the domain where United States, if United States is leaving the world of the rule-based order, then the gap is so huge, so that we won't be able to change the U.S. mindset. But I think what we need to do is to remain in the rule-based order, because otherwise, I think we're going to be in a sort of a law of the jungle.
Yeah, it's a very good point. We're going to come to your questions in a couple of minutes, but just one more thorny issue, I think, to round off here before we come to your questions. There's a lot of talk about reforming the global system, whether it's the UN Security Council or the World Bank or the IMF. I mean, Misha, how can a country like Uganda and others, how can you actually go about pushing these questions forward? I mean, they've been discussed for decades, and it seems that the people with power obviously don't want to give it up, and we just repeat the same conversation over and over again. How can we actually move forward on making a kind of a fairer system? Because I think if the rules-based order is going to survive, it does also need to be rebalanced, or it's just going to look hypocritical and unfair.
The message is very clear that even now, as you look at reforms with the G7, for example, at the United Nations Security Council, there should be much more inclusiveness of nations like, say, Uganda. Say, if you don't like Uganda, say another influential country in Africa, in South America, in the Caribbean. Broaden the base, so that broadens the dialogue, broadens the perspective of what it is that we're trying to do to bridge that particular gap. In terms of the multilateral financial organizations, such as the bank and other organizations, one of the key factors that we wanted was a really comprehensive and durable solution to external debt. We've got to be able to get debt relief and not be hung onto a political, okay, if you drink my water, then I'll give you the debt relief. No, it shouldn't be that. It's got to be, for the economic reasons, to bridge the gap between our peoples, to get a better global perspective of life and a better security, and also in terms of what is relevant for handling the issues of the climate change and the impact of it, be it in Africa, be it in the OACP states, the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific states, small states, or anywhere. So that's where it's key. You've got to be able to be part of it, and it's not dominated, so that if the head of the World Bank is told by White House to do this, then they've got to do it. Well, it's got to be independent and inclusive. United Nations Security Council has got to allow all the members from across the global south. So if you're talking about bridging the gap, it's bridging the gap across the board. And it is not just trying to say, well, China is the one that's giving all the influence. No, they're giving a lot of development aid, development funds. It may not be aid, but it's money. But you need to have the railway. And today in Kenya, for example, you have a railway that takes you from Mombasa to Nairobi. Yes, there is a debt, fine. But at least the people have access to get to the city. I'm just giving you a small example, okay? So a motorway, what used to take 4 hours to go from Nairobi Airport to Westlands, now takes you 15 minutes because there's a fantastic, it's a game changer in people's lives and makes, and it protects the environment because you're not sitting there blowing petrol fumes for 4 hours of, millions of cars. I mean, that's just to give you a simple example. And then protect the wildlife, protect the animals in the game parks. All this has to be with inclusion in the countries of the Global South. And I think the next 3 years that President Museveni and the leaders have really come to a conclusion, and there are going to be regular meetings, and it will be welcome for all of you to participate and share your thoughts to members of the countries with which you have. And of course, we have a lot of focus on science and technology and development now in the future in this dialogue.
Great. Well, I want to open it up to questions. So please raise your hand, and then someone will come to you with a mic and just tell us who you are and if you have any affiliation. Yeah, I think let's start here, the gentleman at the front.
Thank you very much. Deepak Lalwani from Lal Cap. I actually specialize in India, but I've got a question for Her Excellency Nimisha Madhwani. You mentioned there was a comment earlier about the debt trap diplomacy by China, and you mentioned that it's really seen as development. So do you see China's role increasing in Africa, or do you think there'd be a pushback as people begin to think about the pitfalls of the debt trap?
Thank you. Nice to see you. I don't see a pullback, but I do see people being more cautious on agreements, countries, governments, so that affordability in terms of the budget release. But that's why it goes back to this issue of debt relief. There needs to be a sustainable debt relief program to be put into place. And on China, there will be a lot more care. But they're very, very clear on areas of assistance, same as India. Very clear. Not just take, and I think there's a story that they just want natural resources. And now, for example, the policy in East Africa is no export of raw materials, 0. It's got to have a value addition, whether it's agriculture, whether it's minerals, whatever it is.
Perhaps I could just add that one point to note is there's also been a course correction of sorts by Beijing. It's become far more risk averse in its outbound investment. It's focusing more on cleaner, greener, and more sustainable investment. So I think that's something to also be aware of. There's a BRI 2.0 of sorts.
Yeah. Our next question. Adele.
Thank you so much. My name's Emiratus. I'm from South Africa. I just wanted to ask, how can the quote unquote global South, and I suppose the global North too, how can we start to move away from the significant perception gap that there is still? I mean, I think there's a lot more opportunity in, for example, African countries that people are not acknowledging. African countries, for example, are some of the fastest urbanizing countries in the world. They're the fastest growing economies with incredibly young populations. And on the other hand, you've got countries like Japan, which have increasingly older populations. There's demographic transition. Japan also has an extremely large pension fund, which is investing internationally. Is there not a natural synergy there? Seeing it from a kind of opportunity orientation, a future forward orientation, rather than necessarily just a geopolitical conflict. Or I think there's a lot more commonality between the North and South that I think there's kind of a middle ground. Anyway, I just wanted to get the panel's thought on that. And yeah, thank you so much.
Should I go? I mean, it's really hard to, yes, there is a differences, and I think there is a different trends. I mean, Africa, for example, is growing economically and population-wise, whereas Japan and most of the G7 countries are in a low growth, low birth rate. I think in terms of this, economic and the good demographic side, if you just focus on it, it's the most reasonable a reasonable mix of that is to have a transfer of the people from global south to global north. But I mean, here in UK, everyone is talking about the migration policies, and increasingly, United States is rejecting the immigrations. And I think Japan traditionally have a very strict immigration policy, while accepting gradually the foreign workers, but still, the door is relatively closed. So these are pretty much political issue, and particularly in the time of the difficult, well, in the difficult times, and particularly in UK and the United States, which are facing the election, the migrants immigration policy is easily become as a very hot debate, and it's really difficult to make the decision to make these sort of a reasonable, economically rational choices. So it's not that easy. I mean, as a political scientist, it's really hard to find the middle ground to mitigate all these risks on the both sides.
I mean, is India sort of trying to pursue more of that angle of talking about the opportunities? Is that a difference there?
Yes, and again, a gap between the rhetoric and reality. I think India, like a lot of other countries in the G7 and elsewhere, is pursuing an increasingly economic nationalist and protectionist agenda, which I think is essentially undermining engagement between the Global South and the G7. I mean, one of the key demands for countries in the Global South is market access. But with these more protectionist policies, whether it be the US Inflation Reduction Act or the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, essentially limiting that access. And I think that the same is true of India. And the interesting thing with India is India, in some ways, it's competing with other countries in the Global South rather than complementing them. If you look at the current free trade negotiations or FTAs that India has signed recently, they're with advanced economies. It's Australia, the UAE. They've recently concluded an FTA with EFTA countries. There's ongoing negotiations with the UK and EU. They're not with countries in the Global South. I think Peru is the only one which comes to mind. Yeah, and then there's obviously, but I think that that they're trying to gain more market access into Western developed advanced economies, and to a degree they're competing with other economies in the Global South.
Okay, next question. We'll have one right at the back at the top.
My name is Prajwal. I'm a SOAS alumni. My question to the professors is, can countries such as Brazil and India leverage their unique partnerships with both the G7 countries as well as their adversaries in Russia, Iran, to actively bring an end to the conflicts that are taking place?
Well, yeah, I mean, speaking for India, I think, I mean, if you look at, say, its position on the war in Ukraine, there was the much touted statement by Prime Minister Modi that now is not the era of war. But again, there's a gap between the statements and the substance. I keep going back to this. But in terms of what India is actually able to do, similar or willing to do, I think it's generally quite limited. It's limited to protecting its own national interests. That's very much what dictates its policies and foreign policy. And I think, I can't really speak for Brazil, but what you do see is, for instance, there's also a lack of consensus. So look at the BRICS. If you ask, I'm not referring here to the expanded BRICS, but the original BRICS member states, I think every country would have a different response to what is the purpose of the BRICS. So I think for Brazil and India, it's primarily economic. For China, it's more about promoting its ideology, its global development, civilization, security initiative. For Russia, it's a means of staying engaged with the international community after facing isolation after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think there's a lack of consensus within the global south. I think India, countries like, I can't really speak for Brazil, but India has generally played quite a limited role in trying, in addressing some of these flashpoints. So whether it be the Israel-Palestine issue or Russia-Ukraine, it's actually been a beneficiary, in terms of access to discounted Russian crude and exporting refined product, which is finding its way back onto Western markets. So yeah, I think it's been very much driven by self-interest.
On BRICS, so not to put you on the spot, but has Uganda thought about BRICS? Is that a conversation that's been had?
Oh, well, actually, Uganda, much before the wars in Russia and Ukraine, BRICS has been there for some time now. Uganda and a couple of other African countries, Angola, etc., have been actually observers and participated in BRICS conferences and summits in both South Africa and also in other regions. So it's part of what we're saying in the Global South, that there has to be an inclusiveness. You've got to bring the people together, the countries and the politicians, even if the Biden administration wants one thing versus the rest of the world, there's got to be a dialogue.
And one question from online, maybe for you, Kazito, from Saban Abdi from Wilton Park, about the G7, given the growing sort of multipolarity and perhaps what you're saying about some divides between the G6 and the G1. Do you foresee a time when the G7 would just become redundant? I guess that would imply some sort of split between the US and the rest, maybe in the next 6 to 9 months, depending on what happens in their election.
Well, it's, the redundancy of G7 has been on table for many years. I think in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, that was the G8. And there was an expectation that after the end of Cold War, G7 will be the center of the global management, the management of the global governance. And that wasn't really resonated in that context. I think having a framework of G7 is important. I mean, even though it won't be producing much of the significant, meaningful documents, but still meeting these leaders are important. If United States, particularly when Mr. Trump has elected as a president, and then boycotting the G7, that will be a disaster. But as long as United States respect the meaning of having this G7 and participate in it, that is still something to make sure that we'll be able to hold United States within the certain framework. Otherwise, it's going to be a disaster. So we are not expecting, or we shall not expect that the G7 can change the course. I think we may suggest something, but it doesn't have the enforceable power over the decisions that is made by the United States. So I think what we can expect, the role of G7 as the placeholder of the United States in the international system.
The front here, gentleman in the tie.
Thank you. Francis Dinko, Chatham House member. Her Excellency, if you see the UN Sustainable Development Goals as the means through which the G7 should be bridging its relationship with the global South as a means of investment and development.
Yes, yes. So that's what we're saying, that we're actually a little worried, and that we are actually lagging behind in the implementation of those SDGs. So we've got to find a way forward where all the global South countries, and that's where it's inclusiveness to be able to implement the SDGs, which includes, the new fund that was declared recently at the COP28, the $100 billion fund for climate change and to deal with those. These are issues that will go towards the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Any more questions? Yeah, gentleman here. Front. You just wait for the mic. Thank you.
I think it's called the green.
Hello, thank you for coming, Her Excellency. My name is Dr. VC Daniel from Israel. Last 2 weeks, I had a meeting with the Dutch ambassador to United Kingdom and Austrian ambassador to UK. I'm also belong to Universal Peace Federation here in UK. I would, International Women's Day coming soon. I would like to speak a little bit about the role of in Afghanistan.
Well, the Women's Day, well, for us in our part of the world, I don't think it's really a big topic, but it is, of course, a big concern that women are being marginalized, and the money that's been spent on that war, which hasn't really attained what it should have attained. Don't worry.
We've probably got time.
It needs global pressure to the government, but it's an internal affair of a country. You cannot go in to get involved in another country's, regulations.
We've probably got time for just a couple more questions. I might just take them in one go. Yeah, the gentleman here and then at the front.
Hello, my name is Abdi Fatah. I'm originally from Somalia, so I'm going to ask a question related to the Africa. China alone is not present in Africa right now. The Turkey are also present, and they're doing okay. So my question is, what are they doing differently that the G7 are not doing? And in terms of the sharing the know-how, what is why the G7 are still lagging behind? Sharing technology,
Yeah,
for
okay.
example, the know-how.
Yeah. Okay, and at the front. We'll take both together.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Chris Jones. I'm a policy lead on European law in the UK's Department for Transport. And because at the start, you mentioned the fact that the G7 and the West more broadly is becoming less and less economically powerful. Now, the way I keep seeing this question phrased, my perception of it this evening and in many fora around the world is, what can the G7 on broadly the West do to bridge this gap? How soon, realistically, do you think it is that this question will be inverted? That the question will be, what can the Global South do to bridge the gap to us?
Trying to set the ball rolling, so to speak, in a faster track, not on the slow track, with the actual, decisions that are made in the Kampala Declaration of January, which I have a copy of for you.
So I'm answering the first question. I think G7 has done a certain effort to share the knowledge and technology by providing the human resources training, the capacity building. I am involved in the lot of bilateral or multilateral programs in developing the agricultural technologies and infrastructure building technologies. There are a number of the people visiting Japan and get training, all that. So I think, of course, it's not sufficient, maybe, but I think there are numerous efforts have done to transfer technologies to and know-hows to Global South. For example, my University of Tokyo, has about accepting half of its graduate school as the foreign students, especially funded by the World Bank, IMF, and the other international financial institutions, to give a training and education for those people from the Global South countries. So I think there are a number of opportunities of the transfer in technologies. Whether to capitalize it or not is something that those countries will take advantage of. So I think it's not really, I mean, if you need to expand that, yes, I think there are needs to expand this, but given the limited resources and possibilities, I think there are certain limitations that we can do.
Well, I think with that, we're out of time, but there's another hour for us to have drinks and continue the discussion and share views. I think most of the panel will be sticking around, so please come up and ask them any questions. If you've joined us online, thank you very much. But as I said, if you're here, we'll have drinks for the next hour, and you can also see the I New Stories exhibition about Japan's indigenous people. But thank you so much for joining us, and please join me in giving a round of applause to our excellent panelists today. Thank you, that was really good.